The light drizzle continued to fall over New York, casting a cold and somber atmosphere. The raindrops, like tiny crystal teardrops, touched the pavement, dampening everything around. The rain wasn't heavy enough to make people rush indoors, but it was persistent enough to leave the air chilly and melancholic. In a secluded corner of the city, under a tattered umbrella, Alina sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the old bicycle beside her and the wilted bouquet she hadn't sold. The rain had seeped through her clothes, making her shiver, but she was used to enduring the cold. Life had taught her to never complain, to never expect kindness from the world. She wasn't just a homeless girl trying to survive. She had once been Alina DaCosta, the beloved daughter of a wealthy family. But fate had other plans. A single tragic event had turned her world upside down, snatching away the warmth of her past and leaving her lost in the unforgiving streets. She had spent years trying to forget, yet some memories refused to fade. Suddenly, a luxury car came to a halt in front of her. The sleek black vehicle stood out in contrast to the grim surroundings. Alina looked up and saw a tall, well-dressed man stepping out. Ahan Malhotra, the infamous cold-hearted CEO, walked towards her, his presence commanding attention. "Do you need help?" His deep voice cut through the rain, warm yet authoritative, as though nothing in this world could shake him. Alina hesitated before shaking her head. "No, thank you," she replied, her voice hoarse from the cold. But Ahan didn't leave. He stood there, observing her with sharp eyes, as if assessing something deeper than her ragged clothes and damp hair. "You don't seem fine at all," he said after a moment. "Let me help. I'll buy all your flowers." Alina's tired eyes met his in surprise. People usually passed by without a second glance. Some ignored her completely, others looked at her with pity, but no one had ever spoken to her with such certainty. She didn't have the energy to refuse anymore. After a pause, she gave a small nod. Ahan reached into his pocket, paid for the flowers without hesitation, and then did something completely unexpected. He removed his black leather coat and handed it to her. "You need to stay warm," he said firmly. "The rain is getting worse." Alina stared at the coat, unsure of how to react. She wasn't used to accepting help from strangers. This feeling was foreign, indescribable. She hesitated before murmuring, "Thank you." Ahan simply nodded, turned around, and stepped back into his car. As the car drove away, Alina found herself staring at it until it disappeared into the distance. For the first time in years, she felt something strange, something almost forgotten. That night, even with the rain still falling, she didn't feel quite as alone. The next morning, Alina woke up to the familiar routine of survival. But something about the previous night lingered in her mind. She couldn't understand why a billionaire CEO had stopped to talk to her, why he had helped her. Then, her phone rang. She wasn't used to receiving calls, especially not from unknown numbers. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A deep, familiar voice responded. "This is Ahan Malhotra." Alina nearly dropped the phone. "I'd like to offer you a job at my company," Ahan continued. "We need someone like you." Alina was speechless. A billionaire was offering her a job? A homeless girl who sold flowers on the street? What did you say?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I've observed you a few times," Ahan explained. "You're hardworking. You don't give up easily. That's exactly the kind of person we need." Alina's mind spun. Was this some kind of joke? Why would someone like Ahan Malhotra care about someone like her? Curiosity got the best of her. After years of struggling alone, she wasn't about to reject an opportunity that might change her life. The next day, she found herself standing in front of Malhotra Industries, a towering skyscraper that looked more intimidating than welcoming. People in expensive suits rushed past her without a second glance. She felt out of place, small, and invisible. Then she saw him. Ahan stood in the lobby, his cold yet piercing gaze fixed on her. "Come with me," he said simply. As she followed him inside, the opulence of the building overwhelmed her. Luxurious furniture, gleaming floors, and high-tech security systems. This was an entirely different world, one she had once belonged to but had long since lost. Ahan led her into his office, a massive room exuding power and control. His desk was cluttered with papers, yet not a single personal item could be seen. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice as composed as ever. "Have a seat." Alina hesitated before lowering herself onto the chair opposite him. She wasn't used to formal settings anymore, and her ragged clothes felt even more out of place here. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Ahan leaned forward slightly. "First, let's be clear. I'm not offering you this job out of pity," he said firmly. "I saw how you work. You don't let circumstances define you. That's something I value." Alina studied him carefully. His words didn't sound like empty flattery, but she still didn't understand why he was doing this. "So what exactly would my job be?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her doubt. "We have a project that requires someone with resilience and determination," Ahan explained. "I'll give you a trial task. If you do well, there will be long-term opportunities for you here." Alina had no idea what awaited her, but deep down, she knew this was her only chance to step out of the shadows. And she wasn't about to waste it. Alina's first day at Malhotra Industries felt surreal. She had spent years struggling on the streets, fighting for every meal, and now, she was standing in the middle of one of the most powerful companies in the city. Everything around her screamed luxury, from the towering glass walls to the sophisticated employees who walked with purpose. She felt like an imposter, as if any moment, someone would realize she didn't belong here and throw her out. But Ahan's presence was unwavering. He led her to a section of the company she would be working in, a sleek, modern office with large windows overlooking the skyline. "This will be your workspace," he said, his voice calm and firm. "I'll have someone brief you on the tasks." Alina swallowed hard, nodding. She was still trying to understand why a man like Ahan had chosen her. There were thousands of people in the city who would kill for a job at Malhotra Industries, and yet here she was, a girl who had been sleeping on the streets just yesterday. "Why me?" she finally asked. Employees who walked with purpose. She felt like an imposter, as if any moment, someone would realize she didn't belong here and throw her out. But Ahan's presence was unwavering. He led her to a section of the company she would be working in, a sleek, modern office with large windows overlooking the skyline. "This will be your workspace," he said, his voice calm and firm. "I'll have someone brief you on the tasks." Alina swallowed hard, nodding. She was still trying to understand why a man like Ahan had chosen her. There were thousands of people in the city who would kill for a job at Malhotra Industries, and yet here she was, a girl who had been sleeping on the streets just yesterday. "Why me?" she finally asked. Ahan turned, his gaze steady. "Because you don't give up," he said simply. "That's a rare quality." She didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, she focused on the task she was given. At first, everything was overwhelming. The corporate world was completely different from what she was used to. The people, the expectations, the way everyone carried themselves with confidence, it was intimidating. But Alina wasn't one to back down. She worked hard, stayed late, and learned quickly. She paid close attention to every detail, determined to prove she wasn't a charity case. Ahan, though always distant, observed her closely. He had expected her to struggle, maybe even quit within the first few days. But she didn't. She tackled every challenge with quiet determination, and that intrigued him. One afternoon, during a meeting, Alina found herself in a discussion about a major project. She was only supposed to take notes, but when Ahan proposed an idea, she instinctively spoke up. "I don't think that will work," she said before she could stop herself. The entire room went silent. High-level executives turned to her with wide eyes. No one questioned Ahan Malhotra. Alina froze. Had she just ruined everything? Ahan leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. "And why do you think that?" he asked, his voice neutral. Alina hesitated but then gathered her thoughts. "Because the projections don't support that strategy," she explained. "If we invest in that approach, the returns won't match expectations within the first quarter. We need a long-term plan, not just immediate gains." For a moment, there was silence. Then, to her surprise, Ahan smirked. "Interesting," he said. "Explain your reasoning." Alina's heart pounded, but she laid out her analysis with confidence. She expected resistance, maybe even dismissal. Instead, Ahan listened. When she finished, he nodded. "Adjust the projections based on her analysis," he told the team. "Let's explore her suggestion." The room buzzed with murmurs. No one questioned his decision, but they were definitely surprised. As the meeting ended, Alina stayed back, unsure if she had overstepped. But Ahan approached her with an unreadable expression. "Not bad," he said. "You're not afraid to speak your mind." Alina looked at him carefully. "I just said what I thought was right." Ahan nodded. "That's exactly why I hired you." For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. Days turned into weeks, and Alina gradually adjusted to her new life at Malhotra Industries. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. Despite her initial struggles, she adapted quickly, proving that she was more than just a girl from the streets. Ahan, though still maintaining his cold and composed exterior, had begun to notice her more. She wasn't like the women in his world, women who cared only for wealth and status. Alina was different. She worked harder than anyone he had ever seen, and her intelligence and determination were impossible to ignore. But despite the growing tension between them, Ahan kept his distance. He had built walls around himself for years, refusing to let anyone in. He had convinced himself that emotions were a weakness, that attachments only led to pain. Yet, every time he saw Alina working late, her brows furrowed in concentration, or every time she confidently voiced her opinions in meetings, he felt something unfamiliar, a pull he couldn't explain. One evening, after a particularly long day, Ahan found himself lingering near her desk. She was the last one in the office, typing away on her computer, completely unaware of his presence. "You should go home," he said suddenly. Alina jumped slightly, turning to see him standing there. She hadn't even realized how late it had gotten. "I just wanted to finish this," she admitted. Ahan walked closer, glancing at her screen. "You're too diligent for your own good," he murmured. Alina smirked slightly. "And you work just as much as I do." For the first time, Ahan chuckled, a rare sight. "Touché." A silence settled between them, comfortable yet charged. Alina studied him for a moment before asking, "Why are you always so distant?" Ahan's smirk faded. "Because it's easier that way." Alina tilted her head. "Easier or safer?" Ahan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her in a way that made her heart race. There was something in his eyes, something he wasn't saying. "I should go," he said finally, breaking the moment. "Don't stay too late." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Alina staring after him, her mind spinning with thoughts she wasn't ready to face. As days passed, the tension between Alina and Ahan only grew. She didn't know what to make of his behavior. One moment, he was distant and unreadable, and the next, he was looking at her as if she was the only person in the room. But Ahan wasn't the only one with secrets. Alina had spent years hiding from her past, burying Alina DaCosta beneath the identity of a homeless girl who had no ties to anyone. But no matter how much she tried to run from it, the truth always had a way of creeping back. One evening, as she was leaving the office, she overheard a conversation between two executives. "Did you hear? That missing girl, the DaCosta family's daughter. There are rumors she might still be alive." Alina froze. She gripped the file in her hand, her heartbeat quickening. The DaCosta family. Her family. She had spent years believing that no one was looking for her, that she had been forgotten. But now, standing in the corridors of Malhotra Industries, she realized that wasn't true. The memories came flooding back. Warm family dinners, her father's deep voice, her mother's gentle touch. And then, the tragedy. The moment everything had been ripped away from her. She turned away quickly, not wanting to hear any more. But as she did, she collided straight into Ahan. His hands instinctively steadied her, and for a moment, she couldn't move. "You're shaking," he said, his brows furrowing. "I'm fine," she lied, trying to step back. But Ahan didn't let go. "Alina," he said softly, his tone different this time. Not the cold businessman, but something warmer. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, forcing a smile. "Nothing. Just tired." Ahan didn't believe her, but he didn't press further. "Let me take you home." Alina wanted to refuse, but she didn't have the strength to argue. Because deep down, she knew her past was catching up to her, and there was no way to stop it now. The next morning, Alina arrived at Malhotra Industries, but something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a shift she couldn't quite place. As she walked toward her office, she noticed employees whispering, their eyes darting in her direction before quickly looking away. She tried to ignore it, but the unease settled in her chest. Something was wrong. Before she could sit down, her phone rang. Ahan's deep voice came through the receiver. "Come to my office. Now!" Alina felt her stomach tighten. His tone wasn't its usual cold composure. It was something else. Something serious. When she stepped into his office, Ahan was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, his posture tense. His sharp eyes locked onto hers, and she knew he had found out. "You're Alina DaCosta," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Aren't you?" The air in the room turned heavy. Alina's breath hitched. She had feared this moment, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to say. She had spent so long running from her past, trying to erase the name Alina DaCosta, and yet Ahan had uncovered it in a matter of weeks. She swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ahan's jaw clenched. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I did my research. I know who you are. Your family has been looking for you for years." Alina gripped the edge of the chair. Her past was no longer a secret. It had come crashing back, demanding to be acknowledged. I can't go back," she finally whispered. Ahan's gaze softened, but his expression remained unreadable. Why? She turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Because I'm not that person anymore. That life, it's not mine anymore. Ahan was silent for a moment before he stepped closer. You don't have to run anymore, Alina, he said quietly. You have a choice now. But did she? Could she ever truly return to a world that had forgotten her? Alina wasn't sure, and that terrified her. The weight of the truth sat heavily on Alina's chest. The name Alina DaCosta, a name she had buried, was now out in the open. Ahan had discovered everything, and there was no way to escape it anymore. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. And if I don't want to go back? Ahan studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then don't, he said simply. But running won't change the past, Alina. She flinched at the way he said her real name. It sounded foreign now, like a ghost from a life she had left behind. Ahan, you don't understand, she said, shaking her head. That life, it was never meant for me. I was forced into it. Expectations, responsibilities. I was suffocating. Ahan crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. And what about your family? Do you think they stopped looking for you? Do you think they moved on? Alina swallowed hard. She had spent years convincing herself that her family had forgotten her, that she was just a lost chapter in their lives. But deep down, she knew the truth. They had a funeral for me, she murmured. They thought I was dead. They never found a body, Ahan countered. Your father never stopped searching. Alina looked away. Her father, the man who had once loved her fiercely, who had always believed in her. She had left that world thinking she was sparing them pain, but had she only caused more? Ahan sighed, his tone softening. I'm not forcing you to go back. This is your choice. But if you don't face the past now, it will haunt you forever. Alina closed her eyes. He was right. She couldn't keep hiding. The next day, she stood in front of the DaCosta estate, a grand mansion that once felt like home, but now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. She hesitated before stepping forward, her heart hammering in her chest. The door opened, and in an instant, her mother's tear-filled eyes met hers. Alina? Alina barely had time to respond before she was pulled into an embrace, the warmth of her mother's arms breaking every wall she had built around her heart. Tears streamed down her face. She had spent years convincing herself she didn't belong here, but in this moment, she knew she had always been loved. A few steps away, her father stood frozen, his eyes filled with disbelief and unspoken emotions. You're alive, he whispered. Alina nodded, her voice shaking. I'm home. Behind her, Ahan stood silently, watching the reunion. He had done what he set out to do. He had given her back a piece of herself. And as Alina turned to look at him, gratitude and something deeper reflected in her eyes. Ahan had brought her back to a world she never thought she'd return to. But more than that, he had become a part of it. A new beginning had just begun.